When this building was built about 30 years ago, it was more expensive to rent per square metre than the offices in Canary Wharf. I know this because I worked in IT for 20 years and much of it was in this building. It's been locked up for the last couple of years, metal sheets over the doors, concrete blocks in the driveway. It's been affected by three of the big changes that have happened in the last 30 years: globalization, the internet, and now the climate emergency. So in this video, I'm going to look at the four things each of those changes have in common. And it's important to understand change because in the next 10 years, if we're to avoid the worst parts of global heating, every vehicle, every building, every business process is going to have to change. Not in 30 years, but in 10 years. Number one, globalization. I worked in IT for 20 years, and when I first started, it was like a profession. You wore smart suits. If you wanted to take new people on, you advertised in the press, interviewed them. When globalization happened, overnight that changed. Say you were starting up a big project and you needed 10 new people, you just phoned up this number in India, and the next week 10 Indian IT professionals arrived. They're very hardworking, very clever. They were so humble and so friendly, and also very cheap. You didn't have to put them in a hotel. You just found a cheap flat above a fish and chip shop, and you could get 4 Indian software engineers in there. Well, I was never the greatest IT person at the best of times, so I thought, there's no way I can compete with this. So I started buying shares in Indian software companies. I wasn't the only one to notice a change. The owners of the building, or actually the owners of the business who rented the building, they realised that, and they sort of ran the business down. They took money out rather than investing in it. They didn't bid for any new work, so all the sales people left. The pay rises stopped. I left before the end, but I think it probably took about 10 years, even just deliberately running the business down. So I could see a change was going to happen. The owners of the business could see a change was coming because we could see the issues. The owners of the building, probably a big insurance company or a big pension fund, who maybe have been renting out buildings for decades, who regarded it as a safe long-term investment, it's quite possible they didn't understand the nuances of the British work permit system and how it had changed. So these are the first 2 points. In a world of change, you don't stick to business as usual processing, but you can see the changes coming if you know the issues, like I did and the owners of the business did. And there are people though that get caught out, people who don't understand what's happening because maybe they don't know a change is happening. Maybe they're just comfortable with business as usual. I can quite imagine the pensions investor sitting in an office in London thinking, well, offices have always been a safe long-term investment. I don't see any reason to change that now. Or maybe people just resist change through sheer bloody mindedness. It's still empty now though, partly because of the internet, and partly because there's been a lot of new office space built in London, but we'll look at the internet aspect of it. Businesses no longer need to bring hundreds of people together in the same building. And in fact, on this business park, I think between about 2/3 and 3/4 of the buildings are either boarded up or they've been repurposed. So for example, behind us, if I move the camera around, there's a boarded up building that used to belong to Nokia. Other buildings, we lock the camera again. Other buildings on the business park have been converted to residential apartments. They look exactly like open plan offices as they originally built, but now you can see they're being converted into flats because each flat has its own gas flue for the gas central heating, and there's loads of electricity meters outside. And when a flat comes to be sold, you see the residential for sale sign outside. Obviously the internet has affected retail in the same way that this business was allowed to run down. The owners of department stores stopped investing in them. People remarked they became very tired and worn out. The big department stores didn't really have a good internet presence. If you owned a department store and you wanted to get online and do online retail, the best thing to do would have been to buy shares in Amazon, and I expect that's what a lot of them did. The people in the retail trade could see changes coming, but at the same time, there were people who resisted change. If you're a town council, you don't want your town to become some soulless dormitory commuter town. You want to have a town centre, some civic pride. So when the old shop shut, they built a new shopping centre full of new shops, which is now shut. They built sort of like a leisure destination with lots of restaurants. That's more successful because you can't eat online. You have to, if you want to meet your friends and have a meal together, you have to go and eat out. Lots of buildings on this business park have been converted into residential lettings. The same thing's happening to the department stores. They're being torn down, new apartment blocks are going up. But true to form, the town council insists they all have shops along the ground floor, which will soon be shut. With all these changes, with globalization, with the internet, the thing to notice is they've been around a long time and they're still continuing now. Now for the climate emergency. This building can't be let out at the moment because it's too energy inefficient. By law, you have to be in energy bands A to E. This one has energy band G, which I guess means it's got very inefficient heating and no insulation. And it's only 30 years old. So they could let it out if they improved it a little bit. But there's no point in doing that because by 2030, this building would have to be in the top 2 energy bands, A or B, which is almost carbon neutral. And I wonder if such an energy inefficient building could ever be modernised enough to make it that good. But even if you did that, there's another problem with the building, and you can tell it by looking at the size of the car parks. There's over 300 car parking spaces. 30 years ago, the vision for Britain was dual carriageways, cruising along in your BMWs, living the dream. As I'm going to point out in an upcoming video, if we're going to make that 10-year target of decarbonising by 50% in just 10 years, it'll be impossible to drive that far so regularly. And also, with so much office space in London now, if you're a business who wants an office, it's a much safer place to start up, isn't it? Because in London, I think there's something like 20 or 30 million people live within about an hour's train journey. If you bought this office or you took up the rent on this office, you'd have to relocate people because no completely new business could take up so much office space so quickly. So you'd have to be an established business, you'd have to relocate people, which is very expensive. And if you did it, you wouldn't know whether in the next 10 years they'd even be able to get to work because we're going to have to drive much less. You're working here, are you? Are they going to let it out, do you know?
It's being bulldozed.
It's being bulldozed?
Yeah. Starting on Tuesday.
Sorry?
Starting on Tuesday.
Wow, I came just in time.
Yep.
So there you are. It's quite possible your pension fund invested in a very expensive building that's now completely worthless. So we've got so far, we'll look out for change and understand the issues. Some people get left behind because they're being business as usual mode. Change takes a long time, and in a world of change, it's very difficult to plan ahead. I'm going to make another video about how to deal with this because I've taken quite a big bet on the future of the world, and I'm quite sure that even though governments haven't done very much yet, all of that's about to change. And I've got 2 things I want to read you. First of all, this is a speech by Sir James Bevan. He's in charge of the Environment Agency, which is a British government agency, and he's talking to the insurance industry, possibly people who own buildings like this. And he's talking in March 2021, so it's bang up to date. Our thinking needs to change faster than the climate. Much higher sea levels will take out most of the world's cities, displace millions, and make much of the rest of our land surface uninhabitable or unusable. Much more extreme weather will kill more people through drought, flooding, wildfires, and heat waves than most wars have. The net effects will collapse ecosystems, slash crop yields, take out the infrastructure that our civilization depends on, and destroy the basis of the modern economy and modern society. If you think that sounds like science fiction, let me tell you something you need to know. Over the last few years, the reasonable worst case for several of the flood incidents has actually happened, and it's getting larger. It's a pity he didn't make that speech to the insurance industry about 30 years ago, isn't it? If you're discussing with someone the climate emergency, what are the world governments doing, I must admit the world governments haven't done very much yet. Certainly there's no government that's doing enough. But if you're discussing with someone, they'll say, quite likely they'll be in the business as usual mode. I'm suggesting, rather than follow business as usual, they need to understand the issues and have the courage of their convictions to change. And if you think, are people going to change? Can we really halve the world's carbon emissions in just 10 years? Well, number one, we have to. If we don't, there won't be a world economy worth investing in. So take your investments out of carbon-based businesses and find some sustainable ones, which I shall cover in a future video. But today is the 31st of March 2021. On the 22nd and the 23rd of April, there's going to be a summit of world leaders to discuss the climate emergency. It's being organised by the United States government, and here is item number 1 on the agenda: galvanising efforts by the world's major economies to reduce emissions during this critical decade to keep a limit to warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. Now, the President of the United States of America, probably the only country with the political power and the technological wherewithal to make sure the world really does halve its CO2 emissions within the next 10 years. And what's more, it's going to be online. Everyone will be able to watch it. And from my experience, if you want to ask President Putin a question, you tip $20 and it appears up, it gets priority, and you ask your question. But even if it doesn't work, if after this summit online in April doesn't have a big enough effect, I'm betting that it's only a matter of time before public support is so strong that governments have to act. And if you see from the pandemic, the governments could only shut the economies down so quickly. Number one, because of the science, but number two, because of public support. So that public support is going to come sooner or later, and the world is going to change. So watch out for the next video where I explain how to make a lot of money, how to change, how to avoid losing lots of money, and how to save the world.